The knock came soft as a prayer and twice as unexpected. Lenora Graves stood at the narrow window of her rented room above the Dusty Creek boarding house, her back rigid against the world, her fingers pressed flat against the peeling wallpaper as though the building itself might steady her. The sun had long since bled out below the horizon, leaving the Wyoming sky the color of a bruise, deep purple fading to black at the edges. She had not eaten. She had not spoken to a single soul since morning. And she had told herself, over and over, with the stubborn determination of a woman who had survived worse than hunger, that no one would notice. Nobody had noticed she skipped supper until the rancher appeared with a covered plate. The knock came again, more deliberate this time, and Lenora's breath caught in her throat like a moth trapped against glass. She turned slowly, every muscle in her body tensed for the kind of trouble that had followed her all the way from Missouri to this small, wind-blown town of Harrow's Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the spring of 1882. She had run from a man who called himself her husband and had the legal papers to prove it. She had run from a courtroom verdict that had stripped her of everything she owned. She had run from whispered words and pointed fingers and the particular cruelty of small towns that decided a woman was ruined and then set about proving themselves right. She had not run far enough. The voice that came through the door was low, unhurried, carrying that particular quality of a man who had learned patience the hard way, out under open sky with cattle and distance and seasons that didn't care about human schedules. "Miss Graves, it's Homer Hawkins." From the Double H spread out on Cutter Road, a pause. "Mrs. Ellery noticed you weren't at the supper table. She asked me to bring this up to you. She was worried." Another pause, and then something that might have been the ghost of embarrassment in his voice. "I was already on my way upstairs for my own room, so here I am." Lenora closed her eyes for 3 full seconds. Of all the people in Harrow's Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the year of our Lord 1882, it had to be Homer Hawkins standing outside her door. The man whose name she had heard every single day for the past 3 weeks and managed, with considerable effort, to avoid meeting in the flesh. The rancher everyone in town seemed to regard as their personal moral compass. The man who owned half the land she could see from this very window. The man who had, just that morning at the general store, quietly paid the balance on her account when he thought she wasn't looking. She had seen him do it. The betrayal of her own careful independence had burned in her chest the rest of the day, which was at least part of why she had hidden herself away this evening, too proud and too rattled to sit downstairs at Mrs. Ellery's long table and feel Homer Hawkins watching her eat food she hadn't paid for herself. "You can leave it at the door," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, and she was grateful for small mercies. There was a short silence on the other side of the door. "I could," said Homer Hawkins, "but Mrs. Ellery's pot roast doesn't do well sitting in drafty hallways, and it would pain me considerably to deliver a cold meal when a warm one was possible." Lenora turned the knob. She opened the door perhaps 6 inches, which she immediately recognized as a tactical error, because it gave her a direct view of Homer Hawkins, and nothing about that view was neutral or safe or easy to file away as irrelevant. He was taller than she'd imagined from catching glimpses of him across dusty streets. Broad through the shoulder in the way of men who work with their hands not for show but for survival. His hat was already in his left hand, held against his side in that automatic gesture of respect that some men had and most men performed only selectively. He was perhaps 32, 33 at the most, with dark hair gone a little long at the collar and eyes that were some undecided color between gray and green, catching the dim light of the hallway oil lamp. There was a jaw on that man that could have cut glass, and a careful stillness about him that made Lenora think of deep wells, the kind that went down a long way before you hit water, but when you did, it was cold and clean and absolutely reliable. In his right hand was a covered plate, a plain white china dish with a dish towel laid over the top, and the smell coming from beneath that cloth was pot roast and root vegetables and fresh-baked bread, and everything that Lenora Graves had refused herself for the last 7 hours on the twin grounds of pride and heartbreak. Her stomach betrayed her with an audible response. Homer Hawkins had the particular grace not to smile. "Thought so," he said quietly, and held the plate out. "I'm not asking to come in. I'm not asking anything at all. I just figured a person ought to eat." She took the plate. Their fingers did not touch. She noted the absence of that contact with a precision that alarmed her. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins," she said. Her voice was clipped and correct and communicated nothing. He nodded, settled his hat back on his head, and turned to walk down the hall toward his own room. He was 3 steps away when Lenora heard herself speak again, and she was not entirely sure what impulse had overridden her better judgment. "How did you know my name?" He stopped but didn't turn around right away. When he did, there was something careful in his expression, something that was choosing its words the way a man chooses footing on uncertain ground. "Everyone in Harrow's Creek knows your name, Miss Graves," he said. "Small town. New faces don't go unnoticed, especially not ones that have been through what yours shows you've been through." The words landed with a weight she hadn't expected, not cruel but not kind either, simply honest, and Lenora Graves, who had constructed her entire survival strategy around the belief that if she kept her head down and her face composed, the dark past she was carrying would remain invisible, felt the careful architecture of that belief develop a fracture. "Good night, Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Good night, Miss Graves," he said, and he walked away. She stood in the doorway holding the covered plate until his door at the end of the hall closed behind him, and then she went inside and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and lifted the cloth and ate every single bite of that pot roast, and it was the best thing she had tasted in months, and she cried while she ate it, quietly, with her whole back turned away from the window just in case anyone might see. That was how it started. 3 weeks before Homer Hawkins appeared at her door with a covered plate, Lenora Graves had arrived in Harrow's Creek, Wyoming territory, on the Tuesday stage from Cheyenne, with $42 tucked inside her bodice, a carpetbag containing every remaining possession she owned in the world, and a name she had legally reclaimed after a court proceeding that had cost her far more than it should have. Her name had not always been Graves. For 2 years it had been Rourke, the name of a man named Carlton Rourke who had married her in Kansas City in 1880, promised her a house and a life and a partnership, and then systematically set about dismantling every one of those promises while hiding behind the legal framework that said a wife's property was her husband's and a wife's testimony in court carried less weight than a husband's word. Carlton Rourke had been a man of secrets. His darkest secret, the one that had eventually brought the whole structure crashing down, was that he had done this before. There had been another woman before Lenora, a woman in St. Joseph who had lost her father's store and her inheritance and eventually her will to fight. That woman, whose name was Clara, had written a letter to a judge in Kansas City, a letter that detailed Carlton Rourke's hidden motives and his pattern of forced choice and manufactured debt. And that letter, combined with the testimony of a bookkeeper named Silas Drum who had been Carlton's partner in the scheme before his conscience caught up with him, had been enough. Not entirely enough. Lenora had gotten her name back, and the judge had declared the marriage fraudulent. But the money, the furniture, the small plot of land her father had left her, those were gone, absorbed into debts that Carlton had cleverly arranged so that they appeared to be hers. The law in 1882 was not designed with women like Lenora in mind. She had left Kansas City with $42 and the clothes she was wearing, and the absolute ironclad determination that she would not be a woman who let a man's cruelty define the rest of her life. Wyoming had seemed like a fresh start. Wyoming had offered the possibility of being nobody, which at the time had felt like a gift. In Missouri and Kansas, everyone knew her face from the courthouse drawings that had appeared in the newspapers when the Rourke case became a minor sensation. The pity and the whispers and the dark looks from women who thought she should have known better had driven her west the way drought drives cattle. Harrow's Creek was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was a working town, raw and functional, centered on the cattle trade that moved through the territory. The main street was 6 blocks of board-and-batten storefronts, a saloon at one end and a church at the other, with a general store, a smithy, a barber shop, a telegraph office, and Mrs. Ellery's boarding house sandwiched in between. The surrounding landscape was high plains country, vast and spare, with the Wind River Range visible on clear days to the northwest, those peaks white with snow even in April, standing up against the sky with the quiet authority of things that have been there long before people arrived and planned to remain long after. Lenora had taken the last available room at Mrs. Ellery's, a small space on the second floor that cost $4 a week, including 2 meals a day, and she had spent her first 48 hours cataloging the town's possibilities with the methodical focus of a woman who could not afford to be sentimental. The town needed a schoolteacher. The previous one had married a rancher from the Powder River country and left in January, and the children of Harrow's Creek had been attending irregular lessons from whoever the town council could press into service on a given day. Lenora had 2 years of teacher training from a Missouri normal school, and she had walked into the office of Mayor Henry Abels on her 3rd morning in town with her credentials and her references, and a composure that did not reveal the terror underneath. Mayor Abels, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a complicated relationship with decisive action, had told her he would need to bring it before the school committee, which met on the first Thursday of the month, which was still 11 days away. He had also told her, with the particular discomfort of a man delivering information he suspects will hurt, that the school committee included among its members a man named Carlton Rourke, who had arrived in Harrow's Creek 6 months prior and set himself up in the dry goods trade. Lenora had sat very still in the chair across from Mayor Abels for approximately 4 seconds, which was how long it took for that information to fully arrive and be processed and be filed under the category labeled trap. Carlton Rourke had followed her to Wyoming. She had thanked Mayor Abels with a perfectly controlled smile, walked back to Mrs. Ellery's boarding house, climbed the stairs to her room, and stood at the window pressing her palms against the wallpaper, which was where we came in, more or less. The situation, as she laid it out in her mind during those days of careful concealment, was as follows. Carlton Rourke was in Harrow's Creek. He had arrived before her, which meant either he had anticipated her destination through some knowledge of her intentions she could not account for, or it was a coincidence so improbable that it effectively ceased to be a coincidence and became instead a pattern, a dark design, a hidden motive that she didn't yet understand, but that every survival instinct she possessed told her to take very seriously indeed. If Carlton was on the school committee, he could block her appointment. Without the teaching position, she would run out of money within 2 weeks. Without money, she would have no options. Carlton Rourke understood financial pressure better than anyone she had ever known, because he had used it as a weapon and was skilled in its application. She had spent those days trying to see a path through, and she had not yet found one. And that evening, when she had looked at the supper table and seen the faces of the other boarders, all well-meaning people who knew nothing of her situation, she had simply been unable to perform the necessary composure required to sit among them and eat. So she had stayed in her room and told herself she wasn't hungry, and listened to the sounds of the household below her, and felt more alone than she had since the day the Kansas City judge had gavelled his session closed. And then Homer Hawkins had knocked on her door with a covered plate. In the days that followed that first encounter, Lenora employed all of her considerable self-discipline in the project of not thinking about Homer Hawkins more than was practically necessary. This was complicated by the fact that Homer Hawkins seemed to be practically everywhere. He was at Mrs. Ellery's because he kept a room there during the weeks when ranch business required him to be in town, rather than out at the Double H spread, which lay 9 miles east of Harrow's Creek, along the north branch of Cutter Road. He ate breakfast at the communal table most mornings and took supper there several evenings a week, and he had the particular quality of presence that made rooms feel different when he was in them, not louder or more dramatic, but more settled, as though the air itself recognized him and relaxed. He did not push for her attention. He did not make a project of her. He said good morning when they met in the hallway and passed the bread when she was nearest it, and occasionally made some dry observation about the weather or the cattle market that was addressed to the table generally, and happened to make Lenora press her lips together to suppress a smile. She noticed, and hated herself for noticing, that he was the only person in the boarding house who never asked her where she was from, or why she had come to Wyoming, or whether she was waiting for a husband to join her. The others, though well-intentioned, could not resist. Mrs. Ellery asked about her family in a tone of deep maternal concern. The telegraph operator, Mr. Farris, made transparent attempts to determine her marital status. Even mild-mannered old Reverend Potts, who boarded there 3 nights a week, had asked whether she was a church-going woman with an emphasis that suggested he was conducting a character assessment. Homer Hawkins asked her none of these things. He treated her like a person who was exactly where she intended to be and had every right to be there, and required no accounting of herself to anyone. She found this so disorienting that she brought it up with him directly, in the manner of a woman who has decided that directness is the only safe strategy. It was a Thursday morning, 5 days after the covered plate incident. Lenora had come down to breakfast early, finding the dining room empty, and was pouring coffee from the pot on the stove when she heard his boots on the stairs. He entered the room, registered her presence with a small nod, hung his hat on the hook by the door with the unconscious precision of long habit, and went to the stove for his own coffee. "You don't ask questions," she said, without preamble. He poured his coffee and turned to look at her, his expression attentive. "I've noticed," she continued, keeping her voice even, "that you have not asked me a single question about who I am or where I come from or what I'm doing here, and since everyone else in this building and approximately everyone else in this town has been asking me nothing but those questions since I arrived, I find your silence either very kind or very suspicious, and I'd like to know which." Homer Hawkins regarded her for a moment with those gray-green eyes that gave nothing away for free. "Both," he said. "That's not an answer. It's an honest one," he said, and sat down at the table with his coffee. "Sit down, Miss Graves. I'll tell you what I know, which is more than you might expect, and then you can decide what you want to do with it." She sat, because the directness of it matched her own approach, and because she was tired of moving through this town as though every conversation was a minefield she had to cross on tiptoe. "Carlton Rourke talks a great deal," said Homer Hawkins, in the same even tone he might have used to discuss feed prices. "He came to town 6 months ago and inserted himself into every civic committee he could find, and in 6 months he has mentioned you by name, the name Rourke, not Graves, approximately 11 times in conversations I was present for. He paints a particular picture. Man wronged by a faithless wife, moral cautionary tale. He tells it with the kind of detail that makes it feel true if you don't look at it closely." Lenora's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "He came here first," she said. "He came here first," Homer confirmed. "Which means either he knew you were coming or he intends to be somewhere you will eventually be driven to. He's methodical. I've watched methodical men before. They're more dangerous than impulsive ones. Why are you telling me this?" He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than strictly comfortable. "Because someone should have told you the morning you walked into this town," he said. "And because I don't like Carlton Rourke and I don't like what he did to you, from what I can piece together. And I have the distinct impression, Miss Graves, that you have been handling an enormous amount on your own for a very long time, and that you are formidably capable of continuing to do so, but that there might be 1 or 2 things you don't know that would be useful to you." Lenora Graves looked at Homer Hawkins across the breakfast table in Mrs. Ellery's boarding house in Harrow's Creek, Wyoming territory, And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she felt something in her chest that was not fear or anger or exhausted pride. It was something smaller and more surprising, a kind of trembling warmth, the way a fire feels when you have been cold for a very long time and have almost forgotten that warmth was available to you. She squashed it firmly. "What else do you know?" she asked. The school committee met on the first Thursday of May, which was 6 days away. Homer told her what he knew of its members. Besides Carlton Rourke, there was Mrs. Adelaide Marsh, who was formidable and fair-minded and had strong opinions about female education, which were generally positive. There was Dr. Eugene Fisk, who cared primarily about mathematics and tended to abstain from votes that felt political. There was Peter Hollies, a cattleman friend of Homer's who was honest and could be counted on to evaluate candidates on merit. And there was Mayor Abels, who as chair held the deciding vote in the event of a tie. "Rourke will vote against you," said Homer, stating the obvious. "Yes," said Lenora. "Mrs. Marsh will vote for you if she meets you and is impressed." "I can impress Mrs. Marsh," said Lenora, with a quiet certainty that wasn't boasting, just accurate. "Dr. Fisk will follow whoever makes the stronger case." "I have stronger credentials than any other candidate in this county," said Lenora, "and I can prove it. Peter Hollies will vote for merit." "He doesn't know Rourke well enough to be influenced by him." Homer paused. "That leaves Mayor Abels, and Abels will be the problem not because he's dishonest but because he's the kind of man who avoids conflict and Carlton Rourke generates it wherever he goes. So Abels might abstain or defer to keep peace with Rourke." "Possible," said Homer. Lenora turned this over in her mind with the systematic attention she had developed through months of navigating a legal system designed to work against her. The math was actually manageable, she realized. If she secured Mrs. Marsh and Dr. Fisk and Peter Hollies, she had 3 to Rourke's 1, and Abels's defection wouldn't matter. The obstacle was not the vote. The obstacle was Carlton Rourke himself, who would not stop at one committee vote and whose presence in this town represented a threat that extended well beyond a teaching appointment. "He followed me here for a reason," she said. Homer was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she could see him deciding whether to tell her something. "There's talk," he said carefully, "that Rourke has been telling people you took money from him, a specific amount. He hasn't filed a legal claim, but he's been laying groundwork, mentioning it in conversation. Casual, like, the way you'd prepare soil before planting." Lenora felt the familiar cold wash of it, the recognition of a tactic she had seen before. The money. He had tried the same approach in Kansas City, claiming she had stolen funds from the business they had run together, and it had taken Sela's drum's testimony to disprove it. Sela's drum was in Missouri. Sela's drum was not here. "He's going to try to have me arrested," she said. Homer didn't deny it. "I think he's going to try to create enough of a reputation for you in this town that when and if he makes a claim, it will seem plausible." They sat in silence for a moment, the morning light coming through Mrs. Ellery's lace curtains and laying itself in long rectangles across the floor. "Why are you helping me?" Lenora asked. The question came out quieter than she intended. Homer looked at his coffee. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his face that was careful and deliberate and also, she thought, slightly undefended. "When I was 24, he said, "my father lost the Double H to a man who used the same kind of methods Rourke uses. Friendly face, legal paperwork, manufactured debt. My father died thinking he had failed his family. It took me 7 years to buy the land back, acre by acre, and I never once had anyone stand up and say clearly that what happened to my family was wrong." He paused. "I notice injustice when I see it. And I'm capable of saying something about it, that's all." Lenora Graves looked at Homer Hawkins and thought, this man is not safe. Not unsafe in the way Carlton Rourke was unsafe, brutal and calculated. Unsafe in an entirely different direction, the way heights are unsafe, not because they want to hurt you but because the drop is real and the pull toward the edge is stronger than it has any right to be. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Homer," he said. She paused. "Lenora." He smiled then, just briefly, and it was the kind of smile that started in the eyes before it reached the mouth, and it did something to the morning light in the room that Lenora was not prepared for. "All right, Lenora," he said. "Let's figure out how to put Carlton Rourke's plan in a hole where it belongs." They worked on it over the following days with a methodical precision that Lenora found deeply satisfying, primarily because it gave her something to do with all the energy that had been pooling in her chest since the covered plate evening with nowhere to go. Homer provided information. He knew Carlton Rourke's movements, his business contacts, the claims he had been making in various conversations around town. Homer was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, and in a small town, this meant he had accumulated a detailed and accurate picture of the social landscape that proved invaluable. Lenora provided strategy. She had spent 2 years in a Kansas City courtroom learning how men like Carlton operated, and she had emerged from that experience with an education in both law and human nature that no normal school had offered. She knew what Carlton would do because she had watched him do it before, and she knew how to counter it because she had sat across a table from lawyers who had taught her, through their questions and her answers, exactly where the vulnerabilities in Carlton's methods lay. The key was Sela's drum. Sela's drum, Carlton Rourke's former bookkeeper, had provided the testimony that had finally broken Carlton's case in Kansas City. Sela's was now living in Cheyenne, where he had found work with a freight company. Lenora had his address. What she needed was his written statement, a sworn affidavit that detailed Carlton's methods in enough specific financial terms to counteract whatever story Carlton was constructing here. Homer sent the telegram to Cheyenne on a Friday morning, from the telegraph office, using his name rather than hers because they agreed that Carlton was likely monitoring communications sent under Lenora's name. The reply came back by Monday. Sela's drum would provide the affidavit. He telegraphed, deeply sorry for how long it had taken him to speak up the first time, and he had no interest in watching it happen again. He would have the document notarized and sent to the Harrow's Creek telegraph office within 4 days. This left them with the school committee vote on Thursday, which was the more immediate problem, and also, though neither of them said it aloud, the more straightforward one. The problem that wasn't said aloud was Carlton himself, who was not the kind of man who would simply accept being outmaneuvered, and who had, as Homer had correctly identified, a gift for creating new attacks when his original approach was blocked. Lenora met with Adelaide Marsh on Monday afternoon, having arranged the meeting through Mayor Abels, who seemed genuinely relieved to have someone taking proactive steps. Adelaide Marsh was a woman in her early 60s with the bearing of someone who had been told all her life that she was too strong-minded for her own good, and had taken this as a recommendation rather than a warning. She had come to Wyoming as a young woman with her husband in 1861, had buried him and 2 children in the hard years of the territory's establishment, and had built a successful millinery business that now had enough standing to let her speak her mind in any civic forum she chose. Lenora liked her immediately, which was a recognition so clear it felt almost audible. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Adelaide asked pointed questions about curriculum, pedagogy, discipline, and the specific challenges of managing a one-room schoolhouse with students ranging from 6 to 14 years of age. Lenora answered all of them with the direct precision of someone who had actually thought about these problems rather than prepared a performance. She talked about the Missouri Normal School, about the specific methods she had studied, about arithmetic and reading and geography, and the particular importance of making frontier children understand that the world was large and their place in it was not fixed. Adelaide Marsh listened with the focused attention of someone conducting a genuine assessment. At the end of the 2 hours, she said, "I'm going to vote for you on Thursday, Miss Graves. I want that on record between us so you don't spend the next 3 days in unnecessary anxiety." Lenora felt a relief so acute it was almost painful. "There's another matter," said Adelaide, with a slight shift in her expression that told Lenora she was about to say something more complex. "Carlton Rourke came to see me last week. He told me a story about you. I didn't believe it." "Why not?" Lenora asked. "Because I've lived in this territory for 21 years, said Adelaide, "and I know what a man looks like when he's constructing a narrative to serve himself. That man is building something against you, Miss Graves, and he's been at it for longer than you've been here." "I know," said Lenora. "Do you have resources?" Adelaide asked, with the directness of a woman who had long since passed beyond social nicety. "I'm working on them," said Lenora. And then, because something about Adelaide Marsh made pretense feel both unnecessary and slightly insulting, she added, "Homer Hawkins has been helping me." Adelaide's expression shifted again into something that might have been, if Lenora was reading it correctly, gentle and slightly knowing. "Has he?" said Adelaide. It was not a question. Lenora kept her own expression composed. "He has been very practical and very helpful." "Homer Hawkins," said Adelaide Marsh, "is one of the finest men in this territory. I have known him since he was 20 years old, and I watched him rebuild that ranch and his family standing with nothing but hard work and considerable intelligence, and a moral clarity that most people have to work to achieve, and that seems to come to him naturally." She looked at Lenora with that steady, measuring gaze. "He hasn't helped anyone the way he's been helping you since I've known him. I thought you should know that." Lenora walked back to the boarding house in the warm afternoon light with that information sitting in the center of her chest like a stone that had been placed there very deliberately. She found Homer on the porch, mending a piece of leather harness with practiced, unhurried movements. He looked up when she came up the steps. "How did it go?" he asked. "Mrs. Marsh will vote for me," said Lenora. "Good," he said. There was something in the simplicity of that word, the way it contained genuine satisfaction without performance, that made her pause on the porch steps rather than going inside as she had intended. "She told me something about you," Lenora said, his hands stilled on the harness. "What did she tell you?" "That you don't typically help people the way you've been helping me." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the harness in his hands. A wagon went by on the main street below. The late afternoon light was extraordinary, the kind of golden hour light the high plains produced in late spring, warm and horizontal, making everything it touched look simultaneously more real and less ordinary. "Adelaide Marsh talks too much," said Homer. "I don't think so," said Lenora. "I think she said something true and useful." He looked up at her then, and there was something in his expression that was neither composed nor particularly defended, something that was simply itself, honest and slightly vulnerable in the way that honest things sometimes are. "Lenora," he said, and the way he said her name, just her name, nothing else, carried a weight that made the air between them feel different, denser, charged with something she was not ready to name, and he did not seem to be rushing toward naming either. "Not yet," she said. "I have too much to deal with before I can afford to think about anything that isn't immediate survival." He held her gaze for a moment, and then something that might have been the beginnings of a smile moved through his expression. "All right," he said. "Then let's concentrate on Thursday." Tuesday brought a development that neither of them had fully anticipated. Carlton Rourke came to the boarding house. Lenora was in her room when she heard the voices downstairs, and she recognized Carlton's tone before she heard his words, that particular modulated pleasantness he deployed in social settings, warm on the surface and calculated underneath. The voice of a man who had always understood that appearing reasonable was worth more than being reasonable. She came to the top of the stairs and stopped. Carlton was in the parlor with Mrs. Ellery, who was clearly uncomfortable and was managing it with the flustered hospitality of a woman who doesn't know yet that she should be asking this visitor to leave. Carlton was well dressed, which he always was, with the prosperous look of a man whose business was doing well, and he was speaking to Mrs. Ellery in the tone he used for older women, deferential and slightly flattering. "I'm simply concerned for her welfare," Carlton was saying. Lenora was in a fragile state when she left Kansas City. The court proceedings were very hard on her, as they are on everyone involved in such unfortunate situations. I came to Wyoming hoping to help her find her footing. Lenora came down the stairs. She watched Carlton register her presence, and she watched, in the fraction of a second before his expression rearranged itself into the concerned former husband performance, the flash of something that was not concern at all. It was the look of a man who has laid a trap and is watching someone approach it. Dark, calculating, briefly satisfied. "Lenora," he said, turning that performance to full. "It's so good to see you well." "Carlton," she said. Her voice was absolutely level. This was a technique she had spent considerable time developing over the previous 2 years, the capacity to face him without revealing what was underneath. Mrs. Ellery looked between them with an expression of someone suddenly comprehending the depth of the water she was standing in. "I think," said a voice from the doorway behind Lenora, and she turned to see Homer Hawkins, who must have been in the dining room and heard the voices, standing with his arms loose at his sides and his expression calm, "that Miss Graves has everything she needs here, Mr. Rourke. This is a boarding house, not a social call venue. Was there something specific you required?" Carlton looked at Homer with the particular coldness of a man assessing a new obstacle. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced," Carlton said. "Homer Hawkins," Homer said. He did not extend his hand. He just stood there, steady and present, and the contrast between the two men was so stark it was almost architectural. Carlton Rourke was performance all the way down, everything designed for effect, the clothes, the voice, the concerned expression. Homer Hawkins was simply himself, without decoration or strategy, and the solidity of that made Carlton's performance look slightly desperate. "I was just having a conversation with Mrs. Ellery about Miss Graves," Carlton said, keeping his tone pleasant. "I heard," said Homer. "From the dining room." A brief silence. "Lenora," said Carlton, switching approaches with the nimbleness of long practice, "I only want to make sure you're all right. After everything, I bear you no ill will." "That's very reassuring, Carlton," said Lenora, "and completely untrue, but thank you for coming by. Mrs. Ellery, I apologize for any disruption. Mr. Rourke was just leaving." Carlton held her gaze for a moment, and in his eyes she saw the actual thing beneath the performance, the cold, certain calculation of a man who considered her a problem to be solved, not a person to be reckoned with. He had always underestimated her. She had once thought this was an accident. She now understood it was a choice, that he had decided she was weak, and then organized his entire perception of her around that decision and had never updated it despite evidence to the contrary. "I'll see you Thursday, Lenora," he said, and it was both a reference to the committee meeting and a warning. "I'll be there," she said. He left. Mrs. Ellery exhaled with the specific relief of someone who has just narrowly avoided an undefined disaster. Homer looked at Lenora. She looked back at him. "You did well," he said. "I've had practice," she said, and went upstairs and sat on her bed for a long time afterward, shaking slightly in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the accumulated weight of 2 years of this. 2 years of being treated like a problem instead of a person. 2 years of having to be immovable when every instinct she possessed said, "Fall apart, just for a moment. Let it break you a little. You've earned it." Homer's knock came at her door that evening. This time she opened it all the way. He had brought coffee, 2 cups from the kitchen, and he stood there with them, offered out the way he had offered the covered plate that first evening, practical and unceremonious, and entirely without the kind of pressure she had come to expect from any offer of help from any man. "Rourke will try something between now and Thursday," he said. "I want you to know that whatever it is, you are not managing it alone." She took one of the cups of coffee. "Come in," she said. "We should talk through contingencies." They sat at the small table by her window for 2 hours, talking through every scenario either of them could construct for Carlton's next move. And somewhere in the second hour the conversation shifted, not abruptly but gradually, the way seasons change, the way you don't notice the exact moment the light becomes different but suddenly realize it has been different for some time. They talked about Carlton less, and about other things more. Homer told her about the Double H, about the years of rebuilding it, about his mother who still lived in the ranch house and his younger brother Thomas who had gone to Denver to read law and was doing well. Lenora told him about the Missouri Normal School, about the teacher she had most admired there, a woman named Mrs. Hartwell who had believed that education was an act of defiance against every system designed to keep people small. She told him more carefully about her father, who had been a school teacher himself, who had left her that plot of land in Missouri, who had taught her to read and then watched her read everything she could find, and who had died before Carlton Rourke arrived in her life to use the land he had left her as an instrument of theft. Homer listened the way he did everything completely, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just receiving what she said as though it were information that mattered to him. When she finished talking about her father, there was a quiet in the room that was comfortable rather than empty, the kind of quiet that two people only arrive at when they have been paying real attention to each other. He would have liked this place, she said, looking out the window at the dark Wyoming sky, dense with stars in the way that you only got this far from cities, more stars than dark almost. Your father, he loved the sky, she said. He said it was the one classroom you couldn't shut anyone out of. Homer looked at the window with her. Their reflections were faint in the glass, two pale shapes in the lamplight, close but not quite touching. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Homer said. He was, said Lenora, and she felt the grief of it as she always did when she let herself think about him, sharp and clean like the first cold of autumn. Homer stood to go, taking his empty cup with him, and at the door he turned. Whatever happens Thursday, he said, you have already done everything correctly. I want you to know that. She looked at him in the doorway, this steady, dark-haired man with his gray-green eyes and his careful honesty and the particular warmth he carried without displaying it, like a fire banked low but absolutely real. Homer, she said. He waited. Thank you, she said, for the plate that first night and for all of this. You don't need to thank me, he said. I know, she said, but I wanted to. He was quiet for a moment. Sleep, he said. Thursday's a big day. She did sleep, and she dreamed of open sky. Wednesday brought the affidavit from Sela's drum. It arrived by telegraph, relayed from Cheyenne, and it was exactly what they had needed. Sela's, in his careful bookkeeper's hand, had documented in precise detail the methods Carlton Rourke had used to manufacture debt and misrepresent assets in the Kansas City affair. And he had included, with a specificity that made Lenora catch her breath when she read it, a note that these methods were consistent with earlier patterns he had observed in Rourke's business dealings in two other states, in Ohio in 1875 and in Tennessee in 1878. Two other women. Or at least two other instances. The shape of Carlton Rourke's dark past assembled itself on that telegraph paper with the cold clarity of something that had always been true but was only now fully visible. Homer took the affidavit to Mayor Abel's on Wednesday afternoon. He went alone because they had agreed that Lenora's direct involvement might allow Carlton to frame it as a personal campaign, whereas Homer's involvement positioned it as a community member raising a legitimate concern about a colleague's character and fitness for civic service. Mayor Abels read the document with a progressively troubled expression, asked several clarifying questions, and then sat back in his chair with the look of a man who has just discovered that his instinct to keep the peace has been systematically exploited. He shouldn't be on this committee, Abels said. No, said Homer. He shouldn't. If he stays on Thursday, he'll use his position to block a qualified candidate for personal reasons. That's not what the committee is for. No, said Homer, it isn't. Abels was quiet for a moment. I'm going to have a conversation with Carlton Rourke. I think that would be appropriate, said Homer. Homer reported all of this to Lenora when he returned to the boarding house, sitting across from her at the dining room table with his hat on the table beside him, and a directness in his posture that told her the news was good before he said a word. Abels is asking Rourke to recuse himself from Thursday's vote on grounds of personal conflict of interest, Homer said. He can attend the meeting, but he won't vote. Lenora absorbed this. Carlton won't take that easily. No, said Homer. Abels said Rourke pushed back hard, said it was a fabrication, said I was acting on your behalf for personal reasons. He paused and something moved through his expression. I didn't deny that last part. Lenora looked at him. I told Abels that I considered you a friend and a capable candidate, and that those two things weren't in conflict with a legitimate concern about civic process. He believed you. Abels is a decent man, said Homer simply. He just needed someone to make the decent thing feel less risky. Carlton Rourke, removed from the vote, would look for another angle. They both knew this. The question was what form it would take and how quickly. It took the form of a visit to the sheriff. Thursday morning, 2 hours before the school committee meeting was scheduled to convene in the town hall, Carlton filed a formal complaint with Sheriff Dale Thorne, claiming that Lenora Graves had made off with $240 from the Rourke household accounts in Kansas City and had fled to Wyoming to avoid accountability. Lenora was sitting in the town hall antechamber when Homer came in quickly, his face controlled but the urgency in his movement unmistakable. Thorne wants to speak with you, he said quietly. Before the meeting, don't panic. Thorne is fair. I don't panic, she said, with a steadiness she genuinely felt which surprised her slightly. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. Sheriff Dale Thorne was a tall, thin man with a methodical manner and the deep patience of someone who had learned that most situations that appeared to require urgency actually required careful thought. He met Lenora in his office with the affidavit Homer had already placed in his hands, and with the particular focused attention of a man taking his responsibility seriously. Carlton's claim, Lenora explained, was the same tactic he had attempted in Kansas City, where it had failed in court. She provided Thorne with the court record number, the judge's name, and Sela's Drum's affidavit. She explained, concisely and without emotion, what Carlton Rourke's documented history of behavior looked like and what it had cost her. Thorne listened. He read the affidavit twice. He looked at Carlton's complaint and then at the affidavit again, and his expression did the thing that the truth tends to do to a careful man's expression, which is to simplify it. Mr. Rourke filed this complaint this morning, Thorne said. Yes, said Lenora. The school committee meeting is in 2 hours. Yes, said Lenora. The timing, said Thorne, is not coincidental. No, said Lenora. Thorne set down the papers. Miss Graves, I'm not going to act on this complaint until I have time to fully investigate its merits, which this document suggests may be limited. You're free to attend your meeting. Lenora stood. Thank you, Sheriff. One more thing, said Thorne. You should know that Carlton Rourke is going to continue to be a problem. He seems like the kind of man who doesn't stop. He is, said Lenora, but I don't stop either. The school committee meeting was the most deliberately composed hour and a half of Lenora Graves's life. She sat before Mrs. Marsh and Dr. Fisk and Peter Hollies and Mayor Abels, with Carlton Rourke present as a non-voting observer, and the affront of this visible in every line of his body. And she presented her credentials and her curriculum plan, and her understanding of the specific needs of a frontier schoolhouse, with the focused competence of someone who had prepared for every contingency and was executing without hesitation. Mrs. Marsh asked about the higher students, the 13 and 14-year-olds who might have more education than the curriculum demanded. Lenora talked about differentiated instruction, about the method of pairing older students with younger ones in a mentorship structure that benefited both. Dr. Fisk asked about arithmetic methodology. Lenora talked about the concrete to abstract progression, about using physical objects before moving to symbols, about the importance of math literacy for children who would run farms and ranches and businesses. Peter Hollies asked about discipline. Lenora talked about consequence and consistency, and the fundamental principle that children respond to respect more reliably than to fear. Mayor Abels asked about her plans for the community. Lenora talked about involving parents in the school, about monthly presentations where children could demonstrate what they had learned, about the school as a civic institution that served the whole town. Carlton said nothing, because he had been told explicitly and on record that he had no vote and no standing to speak in this process, and the effort of containing himself was visible in the tight set of his jaw. The vote was 4-0 in favor of Lenora Graves as the new schoolteacher of Harrow's Creek, Wyoming Territory, at a salary of $35 per month. She walked out of the town hall into the bright May afternoon and found Homer Hawkins leaning against the porch railing with his arms crossed and his hat on and an expression that was not quite a smile, but was everything a smile contains. "Well," he said. 4-0, she said. He straightened up, and the smile arrived fully then, and it did what she had been carefully not letting herself think about since the first morning at the breakfast table, which was transform his face from handsome to extraordinary. "Congratulations, Miss Graves," he said. "Lenora," she said. "Congratulations, Lenora," he said. She looked at him standing in the May sunlight, this man who had knocked on her door with a covered plate and rebuilt a ranch from nothing and understood injustice from the inside and had spent the past weeks being the kind of steadfast that she had stopped believing in, and she thought, not yet is becoming now. "Homer," she said, "have supper with me tonight, properly, somewhere that isn't Mrs. Ellery's table." He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes that were very warm in that particular afternoon light. "I'd like that very much," he said. Carlton Rourke did not go quietly. People like Carlton Rourke never did. His response to the school committee outcome and the sheriff's non-action on his complaint was to escalate. He sent a letter to the territorial superintendent of schools in Cheyenne, filing a formal objection to Lenora's appointment on grounds of moral character. He increased his social campaign around town, telling anyone who would listen that Homer Hawkins was interfering with a private legal matter, and that the whole situation would be resolved when the truth came out. Lenora had been teaching for 2 weeks when the superintendent's office sent a representative to investigate the complaint. His name was Mr. Gerald Pierce, a small, precise man from Cheyenne, and he arrived on a Wednesday stage with a leather satchel and an expression of bureaucratic skepticism. Homer, who had anticipated this possibility, had spent the previous week quietly gathering testimonials from parents of schoolchildren in Harrow's Creek, and the response had been remarkable. In 14 days, Lenora had proven herself to be exactly what the town needed: organized, warm, demanding in the right measure, innovative enough to hold the older students' interest and patient enough to reach the younger ones. The testimonials from parents filled 3 pages and included names that any territorial official would recognize as community pillars. Lenora met with Gerald Pierce herself, presenting not just the testimonials but the court records from Kansas City and Sela's Drum's full affidavit, which had by that point been officially notarized and filed with the Harrow's Creek County Clerk. She did not perform modesty or distress. She sat across from Pierce as a professional presenting facts about a false complaint, and she was precise and clear and entirely without defensiveness. Pierce spent 2 days in Harrow's Creek, interviewed Adelaide Marsh and Mayor Abels and Dr. Fisk and 3 parents of students, and on his second evening, before departing on the morning stage, he informed Carlton Rourke formally that the superintendent's office would take no action on his complaint as it appeared to be without merit, and that filing further frivolous complaints against a credentialed employee could constitute an actionable interference with the educational system of the territory. Carlton listened to this with the expression of a man who is recalculating. Lenora did not witness this conversation, but Homer did, having made it his business to be present in the general vicinity of the town hall when Pierce delivered his finding. "He's going to leave," Homer told her that evening. They were sitting on the bench outside the boarding house in the early summer evening, the sky doing that long Wyoming sunset that lasted an hour, layering itself in pinks and golds and the particular deep blue of high-altitude twilight. He's calculating whether staying is worth the cost. He hasn't succeeded here. The reputation campaign failed, the legal claim failed, the superintendent's office told him to stop. He'll go. How do you know? She asked. Because men like that move on when a target becomes more expensive than they anticipated, he said. You've been more expensive than he anticipated. You had resources he didn't account for. You, she said. You, he said. I was one resource. You were every other one, the legal knowledge, the court records, the relationship with Sela's drum. You built that over 2 years of fighting alone. I just provided information. She looked at him in the evening light. You provided more than information. Maybe a little more, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet and careful and very honest, that made the evening air feel warmer. Carlton Rourke left Harrow's Creek 12 days later, having sold his dry goods steak to a buyer from Laramie, and departed on the Tuesday stage without speaking to anyone. He left no forwarding address. He left no further filings. He simply went, the way bad weather eventually moves through, leaving the air clean behind it. Lenora watched the stage depart from the window of the schoolhouse, where she was marking the Tuesday morning's arithmetic exercises. She watched it until it disappeared in the dust of the westward road, and then she set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk and sat for a long moment in the quiet of the schoolroom, surrounded by the evidence of small lives learning large things, the slate boards and the readers, and the maps tacked to the wall, and she felt something in her chest that she had been holding in tension for so long it had become a kind of second skeleton. A scaffold of anxiety and vigilance that had kept her upright through everything, finally, very slowly release. She breathed out. The schoolroom smelled of chalk and wood polish and the particular childhood smell of many small people in an enclosed space, and it was the best smell she could remember. That evening she walked to the Double H spread. She had never been there, though Homer had described it. 9 miles along Cutter Road was a longer walk than was practical, but she had borrowed a horse from the livery, a steady bay mare named Duchess who had an agreeable disposition and a smooth gait. And the June evening was extraordinary, the whole high plains lit with the late horizontal gold of the longest days, the grass pale silver green and moving in the warm wind, the mountains clear on the northwestern horizon with their snow still holding at the peaks. Homer came out of the barn when he heard her ride in, and he stopped when he saw her, just for a moment, with a particular stillness that she had come to understand was not composure but its opposite, the stillness of someone registering something important. "He's gone," she said from the saddle. "I heard," he said. "I needed to tell you myself," she said, "and I needed to see this place." He took Duchess's reins, holding the mare steady while Lenora dismounted, and when she was standing on the ground beside him he was close, closer than they had ever stood, and the evening air between them was warm and still. She looked at the ranch. It was beautiful in the way of things that have been earned rather than inherited, not grand but solid and genuine. The main house set back from the barn with the mountains behind it, everything in good repair, the fences clean and the garden beside the house green with early summer plantings. "Your mother's garden?" she asked. "She keeps it up," he said. He was watching her look at it. "Homer," she said, and turned to face him. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes that were, in the evening gold, entirely green, and what was in them was not composed or guarded. It was simply him, open in a way she had never quite seen, and it was the most frightening and wonderful thing she had looked at in a very long time. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am falling in love with you. I think it started the night of the covered plate, or possibly the morning you told me both, when I asked if you were being kind or suspicious. And I have been not thinking about it very deliberately for approximately 6 weeks, and Carlton is gone, and I have a job and my name back, and I am standing in front of the most honest man I have ever met, and I am done not thinking about it." Homer Hawkins looked at her for one long moment in the golden June evening. Then he stepped forward and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was also absolute certainty. And he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that doesn't perform itself. It simply is, warm and certain and deeply real. And Lenora Graves, who had not cried easily in 2 years, felt tears on her face that were not sadness. When they separated, he kept his hands where they were, her face between them, his forehead dropped to hers. "I have been in love with you," he said very quietly, "since you opened that door 6 inches and looked at me like I was either a lifeline or a threat and you were going to figure out which before you committed to anything." She laughed, which surprised them both, a genuine laugh, bright and unguarded. "That was it for you?" she asked. "That was it for me," he said. She put her hands against his chest, feeling his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt, steady and strong, reliable as everything else about him. "Your mother is watching from the window," she said, because she had caught the movement of the curtain in the house over his shoulder. Homer turned briefly and the curtain dropped. "She's subtle," he said, dry. "She's wonderful," said Lenora, who had never met her. "If she's yours, she's wonderful." He smiled, and it was the full version of that smile, the one that reached all the way through his face and made the light different. "Come meet her," he said. Dorothy Hawkins was 60 years old and small and fierce and had the same gray-green eyes as her son, and she had clearly been working very hard not to come out of the house and could not entirely conceal how long she had been wanting this to happen. She took Lenora's hands in both of hers at the door and said, "My boy has not stopped talking about you since March. He thinks he's subtle. He is not subtle." "Mama," said Homer. "He is not subtle at all," Dorothy repeated to Lenora. Lenora felt the warmth of the house, which smelled of bread and wood smoke and the particular domestic sweetness of a well-kept home, and felt it settle around her like something she had been away from for a very long time. "He is extremely subtle," she said. "He is the most subtle man I have ever met." "She's being generous," Homer said. "She is being generous," Dorothy agreed. "Which means she's either very kind or very in love with you, and since she clearly has good judgment, I'm going to say both." She looked at Lenora with the direct warmth of a woman who has decided something and is comfortable saying so. "You'll stay for supper." It was not a question. It was the same voice Homer used when he wasn't asking, just stating what was going to happen, and Lenora recognized where he had learned it. "I'd love to," said Lenora. They had supper at the long kitchen table with Dorothy and with Thomas Hawkins, who had come out from Denver for a week, and who was 27 and clever and openly delighted by the situation, and who asked Lenora 3 questions about the Kansas City case with the focused interest of a man who had been reading law and found the procedural dimensions genuinely interesting. "The affidavit strategy was smart," Thomas said, "using the bookkeeper's testimony to establish pattern rather than just instance. That's the kind of approach that holds up in appellate review. I had a good lawyer in Kansas City," said Lenora. "Even the ones working against me taught me things." Thomas looked at his brother with an expression that was entirely readable. Homer caught it and chose not to acknowledge it, which made Dorothy smile. Afterward, Homer walked Lenora back out to where Duchess was waiting, saddled and patient in the barn, and he stood in the barn door while Lenora mounted, and the night was full of stars, the same impossible Wyoming stars she had noticed from her boarding house window on that first terrible evening. "Sunday," said Homer. "Ride with me in the morning. I want to show you the North Pasture. There's a view of the mountains from there that I've been wanting to share with someone for about 4 years. 4 years, she said. "It's a very good view," he said. "It deserves the right audience." She looked down at him from the saddle, this solid, good, extraordinary man, and felt the full weight of how completely and irreversibly she had stopped being alone. "Sunday," she said. She rode back to Harrow's Creek under the stars with her heart so full it felt architectural, like it was supporting something above it. The summer of 1882 settled into a rhythm that Lenora would remember for the rest of her life, with the particular sharpness of seasons that mean something. The school year ran through June and resumed in September, and in the summer break, she threw herself into preparation with the organizational zeal of someone who was building something permanent. She redesigned the curriculum. She ordered new readers from a catalog. She corresponded with the normal school in Missouri for materials that hadn't yet made it to Wyoming. She spent her Sundays at the Double H. The Sunday rides became the center of her week, and not just for the view from the North Pasture, which was, as Homer had promised, extraordinary, the full sweep of the Wind River Range reflected in a small high-country lake, the kind of landscape that made you feel simultaneously very small and very alive. They rode for hours, sometimes talking continuously, and sometimes in that comfortable silence they had developed between them. And she learned the land the way you learn a person you love, not just its features but its character, the way the creek ran low in July and high in April, the way the cattle moved on hot afternoons toward the shade of the cottonwood brake, the way the light changed at altitude in a way that had no equivalent anywhere she had lived before. Homer taught her about ranch management without making a lesson of it, simply including her in the thinking, mentioning the problems he was working through in the same direct way he mentioned everything. And she found herself having opinions about them, useful ones, because the same systematic mind she applied to curriculum design turned out to be applicable to questions of water rights and grazing rotation, and the specific calculus of whether to winter feed 50 more head than the previous year. "You're good at this," he told her one afternoon in mid-August, not looking up from the ledger they were going over together at the kitchen table of the ranch house. "I'm good at problems," she said. "The ranch has a lot of those," he said. "So does a schoolhouse," she said. He looked up then with something in his expression that was decision-making. "Lenora," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer is yours entirely, and I will be content with whatever it is." She set down her pen. "I want to marry you," he said. It came out with the same quality as everything he said, direct and without performance, just the thing itself. "I want you to have this ranch as yours as much as mine. And I want you to keep teaching as long as you want to because it's important work and you're exceptional at it. And I want to sit across tables from you for the rest of my life and argue about cattle and curriculum. And I want whatever the future holds to hold it with you." Lenora looked at Homer Hawkins across the kitchen table of the Double H spread on a hot August afternoon in 1882, with the mountains visible through the window and the smell of summer grass on the air and Dorothy's garden green and heavy just outside. And she thought about all the ways that the word marriage had been made ugly and small by one man's use of it as a weapon. And she thought about how completely and thoroughly this man before her had been, in every way she could measure, the opposite of that. "Yes," she said, "with all of it, the ranch and the school and the arguments and the future, yes." He was around the table before she had finished the sentence. They were married in October of 1882 in the Harrow Creek Church, on a Saturday when the cottonwood along the creek had gone gold, and the air had the first clear edge of autumn cold in it. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Potts, who had been visibly moved by the whole story once Adelaide Marsh had told it to him, and who delivered the service with the additional warmth of a man who believes he is witnessing something that has been correctly earned. The gathering afterward was at the Double H, in the large front room and spilling onto the porch and yard, and the whole community seemed to come. Adelaide Marsh with her dry wit and her genuine pleasure, Sheriff Thorne who shook Homer's hand and told Lenora he hoped she would never need his professional services again, but that he was glad to have known her, Mayor Abels who had grown noticeably more decisive since the Carlton Rourke affair, Mrs. Ellery who cried throughout the ceremony and was magnificently unapologetic about it, Thomas Hawkins, who gave a toast from Denver that arrived by telegram and was read aloud and made everyone laugh. Dorothy Hawkins took Lenora's face in her hands, the same gesture she had made the first evening at the door, and said, "This is right. This is how things should go." And Lenora, who had spent 2 years believing that things going right was a concept that applied to other people, felt the truth of it like sunlight, warm and completely reliable. The school reopened in September, And through the fall, Lenora taught with a freedom she had never quite managed in the anxious months before, the particular ease of someone who is not perpetually braced for the next blow. The students noticed, in the way children notice everything important, that their teacher was different, lighter in some way, more likely to let a lesson become a story, more likely to laugh at something unexpected. A boy named Francis Prout, 8 years old and formidably curious, asked her one morning why she smiled so much more than she used to. She told him that she had been worried about something and now she wasn't, and he nodded with the deep gravity of someone who completely understood this. "My papa says that's what the right land does," said Francis. "When you find land that's yours, you stop worrying." Lenora thought about this for a long time afterward. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a hard one, the way Wyoming winters always threatened to be, with 2 weeks of sustained cold in January that kept even the most weather-hardened ranchers close to their stoves. The Double H lost some cattle to exposure despite Homer and his hired hands working around the clock to move the herd to more sheltered pastures, and the financial loss was real, though the ranch was strong enough to absorb it. Lenora spent those cold weeks teaching in a schoolhouse kept warm by an iron stove that worked heroically, and doing the ranch accounts in the evenings, reorganizing the ledger system into something that gave Homer a clearer picture of the year-to-year pattern than he had previously had. "You've saved us approximately a week's work every month with this," he told her, examining the new system by lamplight. "You were keeping a general ledger when you needed a categorized one," she said. "It's not complicated, it's just a different structure. Where did you learn to do this?" "Carlton's bookkeeping," she said, without bitterness. "I learned everything about accounts by watching what Sela's drum was hired to do and then watching Carlton try to corrupt it. The honest version is just the same system without the fraud." Homer shook his head slightly, in that way he had of registering the things she had been through without pitying her for them. "You extracted something useful from every terrible thing that happened to you," he said. "There's no profit in extracting nothing," she said. He looked at her across the lamplit room with that warmth in his expression that she had stopped trying to describe to herself, because no description felt adequate. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said everything, with absolute directness and no performance, just the truth of it. "I love you," she said back, and felt it in the full, unreduced way that she had originally been afraid to feel anything, like something the size of the Wyoming sky, vast and clear and entirely hers. In February of 1883, she confirmed what she had been quietly suspecting for 3 weeks. Dr. Fisk, who served as Harrow's Creek's physician as well as its mathematics-minded school committee member, confirmed her suspicion with a calm directness she appreciated. She told Homer that evening, sitting by the fire in the main room of the ranch house, with the winter dark pressed against the windows and the fire doing its excellent work. She said it simply, "We're going to have a child." Homer was very still for a moment. Then he exhaled a long, complete breath, and the expression that moved through his face was so unguarded, so fully himself, joy without reserve, that she felt it physically, like warmth, like the fire opening up. He crossed to her and took her hands and held them and looked at her with those eyes that she had fallen in love with in a boarding-house hallway and said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" "Well," she said. "I feel well." "Good," he said, and then he sat beside her and put his arm around her and held her with the particular quality of care he had always had, present and gentle and utterly without condition. Dorothy Hawkins, informed the next morning, did not cry. She sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a full minute, and then she looked up with an expression that was composed of gratitude so deep it had moved past sentiment into something closer to prayer. "I want to tell you something," she said to Lenora. "Tell me," said Lenora. "When Homer was rebuilding this ranch, those 7 years after his father died, there were times when I thought he was going to work himself into the ground and never look up long enough to find anything that was worth working for," she said. "And I knew that if he ever found it, whoever it was, I would be so grateful I wouldn't know what to do with it." She looked at Lenora directly. "I know what to do with it. You are the best thing that has come to this ranch since Homer came back to it." Lenora pressed her hand over Dorothy's and held it. "This ranch," said Dorothy, with the certainty of someone who has earned the right to say things plainly, "is going to be very full and very good." The school year ended in June of 1883 with Lenora 7 months along, and the students fully informed of the situation and collectively delighted by it in the way children are when a trusted adult's life contains obvious evidence of happiness. She had arranged for a substitute, a capable young woman named Miss Pratt from a town 20 miles east, to take the September opening of the school year and to continue through the fall while Lenora was home with the new baby. This arrangement caused her some private struggle, because teaching was her work and her purpose, and she was not entirely comfortable with any period away from it. She had talked about it with Homer over several evenings in the May before the school year ended, and he had listened to the whole shape of her concern without trying to simplify it. "You're worried that if you step away it becomes permanent," he said. "I'm worried that the school needs continuity, and that if I'm away too long the committee will decide that continuity means replacing me," she said. "Adelaide Marsh is on the committee," Homer said. "Adelaide Marsh is on the committee," she agreed with the slight smile this produced. "But I want to go back in January, not September." "Then go back in January," he said. "Miss Pratt can teach September and October and November, and in December you can begin transitioning back, and in January the school is yours again." "And the baby?" "Dorothy would be glad of it," he said simply. "She's already told me so. She wants to be needed." Lenora thought about this, about the particular grace of a household that was willing to build itself around all of the things that mattered, not just the traditionally sanctioned ones. "Your mother," she said, "is an extraordinary person." "She raised extraordinary children," he said, with the minimal but genuine pride of it. "Thomas is extraordinary," she agreed. "You're adequate." He gave her a look of deep betrayal that made her laugh until her whole body shook, which at 7 months was a significant physical event. Their son was born on the 14th of August, 1883, in the ranch house of the Double H spread, in a room that smelled of summer and wood polish, attended by Dr. Fisk and Dorothy Hawkins, and attended in spirit, in the hallway outside the door, by Homer Hawkins, who had been told firmly by Dr. Fisk that his presence in the room itself was more likely to constitute an obstacle than a resource. The baby was healthy and large, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's sharp, bright eyes and lungs that demonstrated considerable conviction from the first moment. Homer came into the room when Dr. Fisk called him in, and stood at the bedside looking down at his wife and son with an expression that Lenora stored in her memory with the particular permanence of things you know, even as they are happening, that you will want back someday. He said nothing for a long time. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and the baby looked back at him with the deeply serious expression of newborns who have not yet learned to be anything other than entirely present. "He looks like he has opinions," said Homer. "He has your eyes," said Lenora. "He has your expression," said Homer. "That is the expression of a person who is already making judgments." She laughed, exhausted and full of joy. "What do we call him?" Homer asked. They had discussed names going back and forth through the spring but had not settled. Now looking at him she thought about the things that mattered, about the people who had mattered. "James," she said, "for my father." Homer nodded, and there was something in the nod that was solemn, the proper weight of honoring a good man's memory. "James Hawkins," he said, and the name settled into the room the way names settle when they are exactly right. Dorothy came in and took James with the practiced confidence of someone who had held many babies and whose arms were designed for it, and she looked at her grandson and said his name once, quietly, and her expression was everything she had described that morning at the kitchen table, gratitude past sentiment, all the way into the landscape of grace. James Hawkins grew up at the Double H spread in the latter years of the Wyoming Territory, which was to say he grew up in one of the most extraordinary places and times that North America had to offer a child with curiosity and good parents, and a grandmother who told excellent stories. He grew up with the mountains visible from his bedroom window, and the school where his mother taught visible from the main road into town. And he grew up understanding, through observation rather than instruction, what it looked like when two people loved each other with full attention and genuine respect. Lenora returned to the school in January of 1884 as she had intended, with Miss Pratt retained as a part-time assistant for the larger classes, which had grown in the months of her leave because 3 new families had settled in the Harrows Creek area and brought children with them. The school committee, led still by Adelaide Marsh on educational matters, formally expanded Lenora's position to include the oversight of a school library fund, which gave her a small additional budget for books and materials. She spent the next years building the school into something she was genuinely proud of, adding subjects as the students grew, corresponding with other frontier school teachers across the territory to share methods and resources, becoming something of a reference point in the county for questions about educational practice. The superintendent's office, whose representative had come to investigate Carlton Rourke's complaint and found nothing but competence, came back in 1885 with a commendation instead. Homer and Lenora had 2 more children in the years that followed. A daughter named Clara was born in 1886, named for the woman in St. Joseph who had written the letter that broke Carlton Rourke's first case, because Lenora had never forgotten that she might have been the 3rd victim if Clara had not spoken first. And a second son named William came in 1889, by which time the ranch had expanded considerably, adding the adjacent property that had come up for sale when a neighboring cattleman retired, and which Homer bought with the same methodical patience he applied to everything, acre by careful acre until it was entirely theirs. Thomas Hawkins, practicing law in Denver by that point with a growing reputation for taking on cases that larger firms considered too small to be worth their time, but that mattered considerably to the people involved, visited every summer with his wife, a quietly funny Denver woman named Margaret who made Lenora laugh harder than anyone she knew, and who had an ongoing, warmly competitive relationship with Dorothy over the relative merits of Denver and Wyoming as places to raise children. Thomas and Homer had the easy, fond dynamic of brothers who are genuinely different and have learned to appreciate rather than resolve the difference, and the summer visits were among the best weeks of the year. Dorothy Hawkins continued to be, in her 70s, a force of considerable magnitude. She taught James to read before he started school, which Lenora noted with great amusement was the most significant threat to her classroom authority she had ever faced, since James arrived in the first day of school already reading at a level that exceeded most of her older students. She gardened with the intensity of someone in ongoing negotiation with the earth, and she told stories about the early territory days that the children listened to with the absolute focus that real stories from real witnesses command. Carlton Rourke, as far as Lenora could determine through the occasional conversation with people who might know, had eventually settled somewhere in California and had presumably moved on to whatever came after his Wyoming failure. His name came up rarely, and when it did it had the diminished quality of old bad weather, something remembered mainly for contrast. Silas Drum sent a letter in 1884, addressed to Lenora Care of the Harrows Creek Post Office, saying he had seen the superintendent's commendation in the Territorial Education Bulletin and was glad to know things had worked out, and that it had been a privilege to do the right thing even late. Lenora wrote back a genuine letter thanking him, and they exchanged 2 more letters over the following years, the comfortable correspondence of people who share the particular bond of having stood together against something wrong. Adelaide Marsh retired from the school committee in 1887, with a ceremony in the town hall at which she was presented with a framed letter of appreciation signed by every student currently enrolled at the school and several who had graduated. She had tears in her eyes for approximately 3 seconds and then reverted to her characteristic expression of composed satisfaction and told the assembled crowd that she hoped the committee would continue to prioritize merit over politics, which was, she said, still not a given in any community she had ever observed. She was 81 years old at the ceremony. She lived to be 93, which surprised no one. Harrow's Creek grew in those years, the way frontier towns grew when the land around them proved as productive as the land around Harrow's Creek was. New families arrived. New businesses opened. A proper hotel went up on the main street in 1886 and made Mrs. Ellery's boarding house feel somewhat smaller, though Mrs. Ellery's remained the establishment of preference for people who understood that atmosphere was worth more than size, and her supper table was as well attended in 1890 as it had been in 1882. Lenora sometimes walked past that boarding house in the evening, coming back into town from the school or heading to the general store, and she would look at the upper windows and think about the woman who had stood at that window pressing her palms against the wallpaper, counting her $42 and her determination and her deep reserves of controlled fear, and she would feel toward that woman both tenderness and admiration. She had been remarkable, that woman. She had been handling more than she should have had to handle alone, and she had handled it. She was not alone anymore. She had a ranch and a school and a son who would ride anything with 4 legs and ask questions about everything with 2, and a daughter who was currently engaged in a project of cataloging every wildflower species on the Double H property, with a pressed flower collection that had taken over a full shelf of the main room bookcase, and an infant who appeared to consider the world an endlessly interesting place, and whose expression of baffled delight at ordinary events was the best thing Lenora had encountered since the smile of his father in a May afternoon. And she had Homer. She had Homer, who came home from the range in the evening smelling of horses and grass, and came directly to find her wherever she was in the house, and told her whatever interesting thing had happened that day, with the same directness and pleasure he had always had, and who sat across from her at the dinner table with a content that was entirely unperformed, and who still sometimes, after all these years, brought her coffee when she was working late at the kitchen table, setting it beside her without interrupting. Going back to whatever he was doing, the way you do for someone whose work you take seriously, and whose presence is so fully woven into the fabric of your life that care has become indistinguishable from breathing. She remembered, on a September evening in 1890, standing in the school after the children had gone home, straightening the desks in the quiet of the end of day, thinking about James, who was now 7 and in her school and sat in the second row with the particular expression of someone trying very hard to demonstrate that having the schoolteacher for a mother was not going to give him any advantages, and about Clara, who was 4 and had started accompanying Dorothy to the garden and treating this as a professional apprenticeship, and about William, who was 1 year old and had recently discovered his father's boots and was spending considerable energy attempting to walk in them. She thought about that September morning 8 years ago when she had arrived on the Tuesday stage from Cheyenne with $42 and a name she had just legally reclaimed, and the absolute determination that she would not be destroyed by what had happened to her. She had not been destroyed. The door of the schoolhouse opened and Homer came in, because it was Thursday evening, and on Thursday evenings he sometimes came by to walk her home if ranch business had brought him into town. He came in with his hat in his hand and that unhurried quality, and stood looking at her across the orderly rows of small desks with the evening light behind him, just as he had stood in the boarding house hallway years ago, holding a covered plate in the early summer dark. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the desks, at the readers stacked neatly, at the map of the territories on the wall with its careful lines and names, at the arithmetic problems she had chalked on the board for tomorrow's lesson, at all of it, this life she had built in the place she had been driven to by someone who thought he was breaking her. "Yes," she said. She took her coat from the hook and walked to him, and he held the door open with that habitual, unconscious courtesy that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with who he actually was. And they went out together into the September evening in Harrow's Creek, Wyoming territory, where the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to turn gold at the edges, and the mountains were clear and white on the horizon, and the stars were already visible in the deep blue of the eastern sky before the sun had fully finished with the west. They walked down the main street of the town they both belonged to, past the storefronts and the church and Mrs. Ellery's boarding house with its warm-lit windows, and Homer put his arm around her in the evening chill, and she leaned into his side with the ease of someone who has been doing this so long that it has become part of the structure of the world, unremarkable because it is entirely reliable. "William walked 6 steps today without falling," she said. 6 consecutive steps, or 6 steps across several attempts, he said. 6 consecutive, she said. He was very pleased with himself. "Sounds about right," said Homer. "Takes after his mother." She looked up at him. "Determined," he said. "Figures out what needs doing and does it whatever it costs." She thought about that. About the word determined, which was what you were when you had no other option, when the only direction available was forward, when the alternative was to become less than you were capable of being. She had been determined in that way for a long time. She was still determined, but now the determination was different, pointed not away from something but toward everything she was walking toward, school and ranch and 3 children, and this man whose arm was around her shoulders in the September evening. "Homer," she said. "Lenora," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for the plate still, always." He was quiet for a moment, and then he stopped walking, right there in the middle of Harrow's Creek's main street with the town going on around them, and he turned to look at her with those gray-green eyes that had been, from the first moment she'd seen them in the light of a hallway oil lamp, the most honest thing she'd ever looked at. "You saved yourself," he said. "I just brought supper." She held his gaze for a moment, this man who insisted on accuracy even in his own praise. "You brought supper," she said. "And everything else, and I love you for all of it." He looked at her in the September evening with the mountains behind the town and the stars coming out above them. "I love you," he said. Simple, direct, true in the way only things that have been lived and tested are true, not performed but real. The kind of love that builds itself in ordinary days and hard winters and morning coffee and late-night ledgers and covered plates and walks home through the cottonwood gold. The accumulated ordinary extraordinary substance of a life that turned out to be, against every earlier probability, exactly right. They walked on together down the road toward home.